In Britain, one man saw the comet and a bonanza coming 10 years ago.
That excerpt from the Halley's Comet theme, marking the return of the comet in 1985-86, introduces yet another update of the hotline.
Brian Harper founded the Halley's Comet Society back in 1975.
This week, the speed of the comet coming in has jumped again to well over 64,000 miles per hour.
A telephone Halley hotline keeps callers abreast of the comet's latest progress.
And it is now only 109.
The Society raises money for charity with the profits from cosmic commerce. They have a whole range of specially commissioned souvenirs.
Here we have a water clock, which in fact we have a little tiny Giotto, the spacecraft going up to intercept the comet in mid-March 1986, floats around in water and tells the time. 3 beautiful pewter tankers done by skilled craftsmen in the north of England, in Yorkshire actually, and a little baby cam, so that children who are born in the year of the comet, 1986, can have a little collectible item for themselves. 2 beautiful champagne glasses and superb champagne, if I may just show this for a second. And the champagne itself comes from a small family in appropriately called the Bouzy region of Champagne in France, and it's of excellent quality. What I'm trying to do is, in fact, to generate a tremendous amount of interest in the man, Edmund Halley himself, who is my hero, and in astronomy generally, because I don't think we look up enough. And also this marvelous, majestic metronome of the skies, beating backwards and forwards, you know, has a sort of feel about it, of the ordinance of the universe, which is impossible to resist. And anybody who thinks about it will obviously get as enthusiastic about the comet as I have been and still am.
TV beer commercials have a new star.
No Heineken, no Comet.
Halley's Comet I deflect to stop Younger's bar from being wrecked. Halley's Comet he deflect to stop Younger's bar from being wrecked. For the beer with a head so creamy white, I drop to earth by meteorite. For the beer with a head so creamy white.
You think lab's all right?
I give myself full measure on these occasions. Well, here's to the immortal Edmund Halley and the immortal comet named after him. Oh, beautiful.
Cheers. Well, he's enjoying himself. Halley or Hawley? Well, how should we pronounce his name? I'd always thought it was Halley, as in Bill Haley and the Comets, the pioneers of rock and roll, but perhaps that just dates me. As you've heard, some experts, like Brian Harper, pronounce it Hawley, but most people say Halley, as in this little rhyme written by a famous astronomer. Of all the meteors in the sky, there's none like Comet Halley. We see it with the naked eye, and periodically. Anyway, what are we doing worrying about the pronunciation of the name when we don't know who he was or what he did? Edmund Halley was born near London in 1656. Dr. Magnus Pyke has been in search of the man who gave his name to a comet.
Now, in the 1680s, comets were a mystery to scientists. They didn't know where they came from, what they were made of, or where they were going to. Now, this is the Royal Society, Britain's most eminent association of scientists. Halley was once its secretary, which is why his portrait hangs there. Well, here he is, a perfect example of an English gentleman. Courteous, self-assured, generous with his praise, honourable. Now, we've got here Dr. David Hughes at the University of Sheffield, who's an expert in this field. Tell us, Dr. Hughes, what was it Halley did that caused his name to be linked with one particular comet?
The basic job that Halley did was calculate 24 cometary orbits. And he was able to do this, really, because his friend, Isaac Newton was about 14 years older than Halley. His friend Isaac Newton really pointed the way. Newton, of course, had his very, very famous theory of gravitation, which literally explained why the planets move in elliptical orbits, why, for example, comets move in elliptical or parabolic orbits as well. And of course, Newton wrote all this up in his very famous book called the Principia. Now, we've got a copy of it here. This was published in 1686. In fact, Halley helped to publish it. Halley proofread it. And Halley, I think, was one of the 6 and only 6 scientists in the country who actually understood what was going on in this book. And of course, as an example of Newton's gravitational theory, Isaac Newton had actually worked on the comet that he'd seen in 1680. In this book, Newton showed how you could take 3 observations of a comet. All you really needed to do was know where it was in the sky on 3 specific dates. And from these 3 observations, you could then calculate its orbit. And of course, in Newton's Principia, we have this beautiful illustration here of the comet of 1680. Now, Halley saw this comet when he was just starting his grand tour, and of course, Newton also saw it from Cambridge. And here you can see the orbit of the comet. The comet sweeps in, moves past the sun, and then goes out again, and you can see the tail pointing away from the sun. Now, of course, what Halley did was simply take Newton's method and apply it to another 23 comets. 23 comets that had been observed properly. Now, of course, 700 comets had been seen, but there were only 24 in total that had been observed well enough for this orbital calculation to be done. And Halley spent half a year of really hard mathematical graft on this problem, and the end result of that was this table in this book. Now, this is in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and here you've simply got the orbital parameters of these 24 comets. Now, Halley, being a good scientist, looked at these carefully and suddenly realized that the orbit of the comet that came past in 1531 and that of the comet that came past in 1607 and the orbit of the comet that he'd seen in Islington in 1682 were very, very nearly the same. And then he realized, obviously, that what he was seeing here was one astronomical object, one comet, that is in fact returning to the sun about every 76 years.
Well, Halley died in 1742 and is buried here in the churchyard of St. Margaret's Church at Lee in south of London. And 16 years later, in 1758, the comet returned just as Halley had said it would. On Christmas Day, it was spotted in Germany by an amateur astronomer called Pallich, and soon it could be seen hovering in all its brilliance over the River Thames. Halley had done far more than prove that one comet returned at regular intervals to the sun. He had shown that they were part of the solar system and that their paths could usually be predicted. They were not the doom-laden emissaries of a capricious god. Posterity has been glad to acknowledge the debt it owes to Halley and has shown it by naming after him the comet whose progress through the heavens he charted.
Well, time now for a break. Like Halley's comet, we shall return. But in a couple of minutes, not 75 years. Then we'll be back with the story of the day when everyone thought the world would come to an end. Welcome back to the Halley's Comet Show. Now, Halley's discovery that his comet returned roughly every 75 years gave birth to a whole new ball game, which historians have been playing ever since. It's called See How Far Back You Can Trace the History of Halley's Comet. Now, it helps to know a smattering of Chinese, Latin, and Anglo-Saxon, not to mention a soupçon of ancient Babylonian. Well, that's no problem to Michael Wood, the man we put on the tail of the comet. Now, how far did you trace it back, Michael?
So far, to 240 BC, Russell, although I think very soon we're going to trace it much further back than that. But 240 BC is the starting point. That seems very impressive, but it's nothing when you think of how long the comet's actually been coming over to visit us on Earth, because the astronomers say that it came first 170,000 years ago. And that means, and I think it's a wonderful thought, that Stone Age men and Stone Age women could look up into their night sky and see the same marvelous vision that we do. Now, historically speaking, that, of course, makes you feel rather small. But from the historian's point of view, the comet is actually a rather tremendous time machine. because it's rather like a torch in the tunnels of history. Once every lifetime, regular as clockwork, it blazes into our lives, lights up some forgotten moment, and then plunges off into darkness. And the records of those forgotten moments can bring the past to life and tell us how people felt at that moment when everybody looked skywards. So the comet has been 2,300 times so far, and we have records just of the last 30. They begin in China in 240 BC, 30 lifetimes ago. That's yesterday in the life of the comet. But here it is in the chronicle Shichi, 240 BC, and I've translated. A broom star appeared, a comet in the east, and then in June in the west, and was visible for 16 days. That's the first mention of Halley. But all historians have particular moments which they would love to go back to in time if they could. And I'm going to give you my top 3 Halley observations from history. And the first one is AD 837. That's at the time when the Vikings were raping and pillaging across Europe. And this is the most fantastic visitation in the whole of history. Easily the nearest. It came about 15 times further out than the moon and was visible in broad daylight. It must have been an incredible sight. And this is what the Chinese observations give us from Xi'an in China. This is the Chutangshu. On March the 22nd, a comet appeared in the east. The brightness of its rays became fiercer by the day. On the night of April the 8th, it increased in length to more than 50 degrees, and the tail split into 2. On the 11th, 60 degrees, a third of the sky, and the tail with no branches, pointing to the north. The emperor now summoned the court astrologer and demanded to know why such violent changes were taking place. On the 13th of April, the length of its tail was 80 degrees across the sky. That's nearly half of the whole sky. And the Xintangshu says there had never been a comet like this one. Gives me shivers up the spine to read that. You're almost there with them as they're watching. The second of my big 3 is the most famous date in British history and the most famous return of Halley's comet. It's 1066, and this one was seen everywhere. In Baghdad, it first came like a supernatural being on a Tuesday evening about sunset. Its light wrapped in on itself like the moon, and the people went crazy with fear. In Italy, the tail, it was said, streamed with like smoke across half of the sky. Pene usque ad dimidium fumabant caede. But it was in Anglo-Saxon England that the omens were worse, because the new King Harold was faced with an invasion from William the Conqueror. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us a wonderful impression of what was seen over England on the night of the 24th of April, 1066. Thawieth yond all England, swilch taken on hefenum, jesuan swilchenan man erne jesi. Somme men quaithon that hit cometa se star were, thona somme men hatta thona fexedon staren. It was a sign like nobody had seen before. Some people called it the comet, some called it the hairy star. And even better than an eyewitness, we actually have, for the first time in history, a picture of the comet on the Bayer tapestry, made in Canterbury within a few years of these events. And here it is in replica. There are the English staring up at the sky, and there's Halley's comet. Isti mirant stella. There they are in awe of the star. And of course they had good reason to be, because very soon afterwards King Harold got it in the eye. More than an era ended. Finally, my third big one is perhaps, if any comet has a right to be called the one that ushered in an era of disaster, disease, famine and destruction, this is it, 1301. Now, a young painter in Italy saw that 1301 visitation, and he was so impressed that a couple of years later, he worked in Halley's comet as the Star of Bethlehem into a painting of the Adoration of the Three Wise Men in Padua. His name was Giotto, and he shows it with its white center and its striated tail, stretching 70 degrees across the sky, as witnesses said. So those are my big 3, 837, 1066, and 1301. There were many other memorable ones, of course, not least the 1682 comet seen by Edmund Halley in Islington in North London immediately after his marriage, obviously not as a superstitious man. But last of all, perhaps the most tantalising, is the most recent of modern times until 1910, and that's the 1835 visit, because it was very, very close, 8 or 10 times nearer than the one that we'll see this year. And tantalisingly close too, because there are people alive whose grandparents saw it, and also close because it came at the point when photography was being invented, and yet, so far as we know, its image has never appeared on a glass plate.
Michael Wood.